Before you hear anything else, you need to hear the words that started it all. They were spoken by the new city manager, a man named Marek, a man who wore his ambition like an expensive, badly fitted suit. He was pointing at a map of the old textile district, a place I had spent 2 decades protecting, and he said, with a smile that never touched his eyes, that my work was an obstacle to progress. My name is Arden, and for 20 years I was the head of historical preservation for the city. My job was to be the city's memory, to protect its heritage. But Marek saw history as a burden. He saw those beautiful, hand-laid brick buildings not as a legacy, but as a blight. And he saw me as the person standing in his way. So if you've ever been underestimated, if you've ever been pushed aside by someone who valued shiny new things over things with soul, then stick around. It helps to know I'm not just screaming this story into the void. Let me know in the comments if you've ever had a boss who thought progress meant erasing the past. And while you're at it, hit that subscribe button, because you're going to want to hear how this ends. The public humiliation was a masterclass in corporate cruelty. It wasn't a firing. A firing would have been too honest, too clean. Instead, Marek called a press conference, ostensibly to announce his bold new vision for the city's economic future. He stood at a podium, flanked by the developer he'd been seen dining with for weeks, a man named Silas Thorne, whose teeth were as white and artificial as his development proposals. Marek spoke of sweeping away the decay, of building a brighter, more profitable tomorrow. And then, with a theatrical sigh, he mentioned the bureaucratic roadblocks and the outdated priorities that had held the city back. He never said my name, not at first. He just announced a restructuring of the Historical Preservation Office to better align with his forward-thinking agenda. My reassignment was the grand finale. He announced it with a flourish, a footnote to his grand vision. I was to be given a new special project, a full archival audit of the city's sub-basement storage. It was a place known to City Hall employees as the Crypt. He framed it as a vital task, one suited to my meticulous nature. Everyone in that room knew what it was. It was an execution, performed with a smile and a handshake. I was being sent to a basement office, a windowless room filled with forgotten records and the faint smell of mildew, while my life's work was handed over to a junior staffer who wouldn't dare question a demolition permit. I was sitting in the third row. I had to be. Attendance was mandatory. I watched my own professional life be dismantled under the glare of television cameras. I felt the burn of 100 pairs of eyes turning to look at me, some with pity, some with a kind of morbid curiosity. I kept my expression perfectly neutral. I even managed a small, tight smile when Marek's gaze flickered over to me, a silent dare. He expected me to crumble, to protest, to give him the drama he craved. I gave him nothing. The meeting ended, and as people filed out, avoiding my eyes, I simply walked over to him. He looked momentarily panicked, like an animal that realizes the rabbit it cornered might actually be a snake. I just said, my voice low and steady, I understand my new assignment. I'll start tomorrow, and then I walked away, leaving him in a cloud of his own cheap cologne and confusion. That was the betrayal. But what Marek didn't know, what no one knew, was that the story didn't end there. It was just the beginning. He thought he was burying me in the past. He had no idea I already owned it. The door to my new office didn't click shut. It groaned, a deep wooden sound of protest, before settling into its frame with a final dusty sigh. The room was exactly as I'd imagined, only worse. It was a concrete box, deep in the bowels of City Hall, a place where forgotten things came to die. A single bare bulb hung from a frayed cord, casting a weak, yellow circle of light on a battered metal desk, and a chair that looked like it had lost a fight with gravity. The air was thick and stagnant, a cocktail of damp concrete, decaying paper, and something vaguely funereal. It was the kind of silence that wasn't peaceful. It was heavy, oppressive. It was the silence of a tomb. For the first hour, I just stood there, my briefcase in my hand, and let the reality of it wash over me. This was it. 20 years of service, of pouring my heart and soul into protecting the architectural soul of this city. And my reward was a 10 by 10-foot cage in a basement. The professional composure I had worn like armor at the press conference began to crack. My knuckles were white where I gripped the handle of my briefcase. My stomach, which had been a tight knot of ice for 24 hours, started to churn with a hot, acidic rage. I dropped my briefcase on the desk, the sound echoing unnaturally in the small space. I sank into the wobbly chair, and for the first time since Marek made his announcement, I let my head fall into my hands. The breakdown wasn't loud. It wasn't a storm of tears or a scream of fury, though both were clawing at the inside of my throat. It was a quiet internal collapse, a hollowing out. Every condescending word from Marek, every pitying glance from a former colleague, every memory of a battle I had won for a building that was now slated for destruction, it all came crashing down on me in that dusty, silent room. He called me an obstacle. An obstacle. After everything I had done, he hadn't just demoted me, he had tried to erase me, to make my entire career a footnote, an inconvenience on his path to glory. He thought that by putting me in this basement, he was putting me in my place. The irony was suffocating. He had exiled me to the one place where the city's true secrets were kept. He thought it was a punishment. It was an armory. My mind started to drift, pulling me back through the years, searching for an anchor in the swirling vortex of humiliation. I didn't think of Marek. Not at first. I thought of Eleanor Vance. Eleanor was my predecessor, my mentor, the woman who had hired me straight out of grad school. She was a legend in the preservation community. A fierce, brilliant woman with eyes that could see the stories hidden in brick and mortar. She wasn't just an archivist, she was a guardian. She taught me that historical preservation wasn't about nostalgia. It wasn't about keeping things in glass cases. It was, she used to say, about ensuring the future has a past. She taught me to read a building the way a detective reads a crime scene, to find the narrative in the stress fractures of a foundation or the ghost signs on a faded brick wall. I remembered standing with her on a blustery autumn day in front of the old Orpheum Theater, a magnificent but crumbling vaudeville house that the city wanted to tear down for a parking garage. I was young, full of academic theory, but little practical experience. I saw a decaying building. Eleanor saw a masterpiece. She pointed to the terracotta facade, the intricate carvings of comedy and tragedy masks half hidden by grime. She said, "Arden, they see a liability. You have to make them see an asset. They see decay. You have to show them the DNA." She taught me that the fight for preservation was never won in passionate speeches to the city council. Those were just theater. The real war, she said, was won years in advance, in the quiet, painstaking work of research, in the dusty archives and forgotten legal documents. It was won by knowing more than your opponent. Eleanor had retired about 10 years into my career, leaving the department in my hands. We remained close, meeting for tea every month in the cafe across from the textile district. She watched with a proud maternal eye as I fought and won battles she had started. When she passed away 2 years after her retirement, it felt like a foundational piece of the city itself had vanished. Her loss was profound, not just for me, but for the entire community she had so fiercely protected. A few weeks after her funeral, her lawyer called me. Eleanor, who had no children of her own, had left me a small inheritance. It wasn't a fortune, but it was significant. In her letter, she wrote, "Use this to continue the real work, Arden. Not just the work they pay you for, but the work that matters, the work they don't see." Sitting there in that cold, damp basement, the memory of her words was a physical presence. The real work, this is what she had meant. The city paid me to be a steward, but Eleanor had taught me to be a strategist. The city saw me as an employee. Eleanor had trained me to be a sovereign. The inheritance wasn't just money, it was a mandate. And it was then that the first tendrils of a plan that had been dormant for years, began to awaken. The despair that had hollowed me out began to be replaced by something else. Something cold, hard, and sharp. It was the catalyst. My grief for Eleanor, which had softened into a dull ache over the years, now sharpened into a weapon. The humiliation from Marek, which had burned hot and shameful, now cooled into a focused, blue flame. I wasn't just an archivist banished to a basement. I was a guardian sent back to her source of power. My resolve solidified when Elena, my former junior archivist, found me. She was a bright, passionate young woman who shared my reverence for the city's history, a spirit I recognized because it had once been my own. She knocked tentatively on the heavy door, her face a mixture of fear and fury. She brought me a cardboard box with a thermos of hot coffee, a decent lamp from her own desk, and a stack of files she said I might have forgotten in my old office. It was a small act of rebellion, but in the oppressive atmosphere of Marek's new regime, it was an act of profound loyalty. She told me, her voice trembling with anger, what they were doing was wrong. Everyone knew it. They were all just too scared to say anything. She told me the junior staffer who replaced me was already pre-signing demolition permits, just waiting for the final council vote. She said Marek and Silas Thorne were acting like they'd already won. I looked at Elena, at her earnest, worried face, and I saw myself 20 years ago, standing with Eleanor in front of the Orpheum. I realized this fight wasn't just about me or my pride. It was for her, and for the next generation of guardians who believed that a city's soul was worth more than the square footage it occupied. I opened the box she brought, and inside, nestled among the files, was an old framed photograph from my office. It was of me and Eleanor, taken the day they unveiled the restored facade of the Orpheum Theater. We were both beaming, covered in a fine layer of dust, triumphant. I picked up the photo and looked into Eleanor's smiling eyes. I remembered the promise I had made to her, the promise to continue the real work, the work they don't see. It wasn't about revenge. I kept telling myself that. It was a mantra that began to form in my mind, a shield against the raw, personal anger I felt. This wasn't about getting back at Marek. This was about honoring a legacy. This was about keeping a promise. I stood up, the wobbly chair scraping against the concrete floor. I looked around the tomb Marek had built for me. He thought he was burying my career. He had no idea he had just given me the time, the seclusion, and the motivation to unearth its greatest secret. He had given me a war room, and from that dusty, forgotten basement, I was about to launch a quiet coup that would shake the city to its foundations. The plan wasn't born in a flash of vengeful inspiration. It was a slow-growing seed, planted years ago by Eleanor's wisdom and watered by my own quiet foresight. It had been germinating in the back of my mind, a contingency for a day I hoped would never come. Now, sitting in the heart of the city's forgotten memory, it was time for it to bloom. The first step had been taken years ago, with Eleanor's inheritance. I didn't spend it on a new car or a down payment on a house. I used it to establish a non-profit organization. I called it the Vance Heritage Foundation, in her honor. On paper, it was a small, unassuming entity dedicated to historical research and education. It published a little-read quarterly journal on local architecture and occasionally funded a high school essay contest. It was designed to be overlooked, to be completely invisible to men like Marek and Silas Thorne. Its public face was academic and quaint. Its true purpose was anything but. The foundation was my Trojan horse. With the legal shield of the nonprofit and the capital from Eleanor's legacy, I began the real work. My focus was the textile district, the very heart of the city's industrial past and the crown jewel of its architectural heritage. I knew, with a certainty that felt like a premonition, that it would one day become a target. Progress, in the minds of men like Marek, always required a sacrifice, and those magnificent old mills were the most tempting lambs on the altar. For over a year, long before Marek was even a blip on the city's radar, I spent my weekends and evenings not as Arden the city employee, but as the anonymous director of the Vance Foundation. I became a ghost in the county records office, a scholar of the arcane. I wasn't looking at the city's copies of deeds and charters; those were too easy to amend or lose. I was digging deeper into the original handwritten ledgers, the documents on vellum and linen paper stored in climate-controlled vaults. My ally in this was Mr. Davies, the lawyer who had handled Eleanor's estate. When I first explained my idea, to use the foundation to quietly acquire original land deeds for properties the city thought it controlled, he looked at me over his spectacles, as if I had suggested they invest in a perpetual motion machine. He said, "Miss Arden, the city has operated these lands for a century. Their claim through adverse possession is ironclad. It would be a futile and expensive exercise." I told him, "Mr. Davies, Eleanor taught me that in our line of work, you never assume. You verify, you dig until you hit bedrock." He sighed, the sound of a man indulging a sentimental whim, but he agreed to help, mostly, I think, out of respect for Eleanor's memory. Our breakthrough came not from a deed, but from something far more obscure, a charter. The entire textile district had been founded in the 1880s by a single industrialist, a Quaker named Jedediah Grant, who was as famous for his philanthropy as he was for his textile mills. He had built the mills, the workers' houses, the community hall, the library. The entire district was his creation. When he transferred the land to the newly incorporated city in 1898, he didn't just hand over a simple deed. He did it through a meticulously crafted charter, the Grant District Charter of 1898. Everyone knew the charter existed. It was a historical curiosity mentioned in city brochures. But no one, not in living memory, had actually read the full text. The city's copy was a faded, abridged version. The original was in the county vault, and when Mr. Davies and I finally got our hands on it, we found the master key. Buried in Article 4, Section 3, was a clause born of Jedediah Grant's deep-seated distrust of what he called the transient greed of elected men. The clause stated that the ownership of the three central parcels of the district, the land on which the Albion, the Sterling and the Monarch mills stood, was conditional. The city was granted stewardship, the right to govern and maintain, but not absolute ownership. The charter created a preservation covenant that held the ultimate rights to the land, and crucially the air above it. This covenant could only be controlled by a board established for the sole purpose of preserving the architectural and communal integrity of the district in perpetuity. If no such board existed, control of the covenant would revert to the legal heirs of Grant's estate. And if no heirs could be found after a diligent search, a non-profit entity dedicated to the historical preservation of the city could petition the courts to become the covenant's trustee. Jedediah Grant, a man dead for over a century, had built a fail-safe against the likes of Merrick. Mr. Davies's skepticism evaporated, replaced by a glint of pure intellectual excitement. It was legally complex, archaic, and beautiful. The city, through decades of bureaucratic laziness, had never established the specified board. They had simply assumed they owned it all. We spent the next 6 months engaged in a quiet, painstaking legal process. We hired genealogists who confirmed that Grant's direct line had died out in the 1950s. We meticulously documented the Vance Heritage Foundation's mission and activities, proving it was exactly the kind of entity Grant's charter had envisioned. We filed the petition in a sleepy probate court in a neighboring county, where it would attract no attention. The city was never notified, because legally, they weren't the owners, they were merely the stewards who had neglected their duty. 6 months before Merrick even arrived in our city, a judge quietly signed an order granting the Vance Heritage Foundation trusteeship of the Grant District Preservation Covenant. We now held the original deeds and the air rights for the 3 most important properties in the textile district. We didn't own the buildings themselves, but we owned the ground they stood on, and the sky above them. Nothing could be built, demolished, or sold without our approval. It was a checkmate that had been placed on the board years before the game had even begun. Now, in my basement office, the pieces were all in place. My special project of auditing the archives was the perfect cover. I had unlimited, unquestioned access to every blueprint, every survey, every internal memo about the district, and I had Elena. My loyal insider became my eyes and ears. She would leave folders on my desk after hours, filled with copies of emails between Marek and Silas Thorne. The correspondence was damning. They weren't just planning a redevelopment, they were planning a corporate raid. They spoke of tax abatements, of shell corporations to hide profits, of fast-tracking environmental reviews. They referred to the historical buildings as carcasses and the preservation laws as nuisances. Every email was another nail in their coffin, and I saved every single one to a secure, encrypted drive. My time in the basement wasn't a period of exile, it was my final staging ground. I was a general in a bunker, reviewing enemy intelligence, confirming my supply lines, and waiting for the perfect moment to strike. I let Marek have his public victory. I let him and Thorne celebrate their imminent triumph. I let them draw up their plans, sign their preliminary contracts, and hire their demolition crews. I let them move their bulldozers into position, because I knew that their vision of the future was built on a foundation of sand, and I was about to wash it all away. It wasn't about revenge. It was about strategy. It was about the beautiful, elegant, and inescapable logic of a forgotten 19th century charter. The morning the bulldozers arrived was a symphony of industrial violence. The deep, guttural roar of diesel engines echoed off the old brick facades of the textile district, a sound that felt like a desecration. A fine dust, the pulverized remains of a smaller, outlying warehouse they were tearing down first, drifted through the air, catching the early morning light in a hazy, golden shroud. I watched from the second-floor window of the cafe across the street, the same cafe where Eleanor and I used to have our monthly teas. I had a clear view of the Albion Mill, the magnificent centerpiece of the district, its tall, proud clock tower, standing silhouetted against the sky. In front of it, Marek and Silas Thorne were in their element. They were surrounded by news crews, grinning, pointing at architectural renderings of the glass and steel monstrosity they planned to erect in its place. Marek was in a sharp suit, looking every bit the visionary leader. Thorne, in a hard hat that looked like it had never seen a day of actual work, was radiating the smug confidence of a man who believed money could solve any problem. They were performing for the cameras, two actors in a play about progress, completely unaware that the stage was about to collapse beneath them. I took a slow sip of my coffee. It was hot and black. My hands were perfectly steady. There was no tremor of anger, no flutter of anxiety. There was only a profound and chilling calm. This wasn't a confrontation. It was a conclusion. It was the final, inevitable result of a mathematical equation I had written years ago. While they postured and preened, my lawyer, Mr. Davies, was walking calmly toward them. He looked wonderfully out of place in his rumpled tweed jacket, carrying a simple leather briefcase, an island of analog dignity in a sea of digital cameras and manufactured soundbites. He wasn't flanked by security or assistants. He walked alone, with the unhurried gait of a man who knows he holds all the cards. I watched as he approached the little circle of self-congratulation. A junior aide tried to intercept him, but Davies simply sidestepped him with the ease of a man navigating a crowded train station. He walked directly up to Marek, who was in the middle of a sentence about unlocking the district's potential. Marek stopped, his smile faltering for a fraction of a second. He clearly recognized Davies from somewhere, but couldn't place him. He looked annoyed at the interruption. Davies didn't say a word at first. He just opened his briefcase and took out a single thick envelope. He handed it to Marek. From my vantage point, I couldn't hear what was said, but I could read the scene as clearly as if I were standing next to them. Marek took the envelope, a look of confusion on his face. He probably thought it was a complaint from some crackpot citizen. He tore it open. As he pulled out the sheaf of papers inside, his expression began to shift. The confident political smile melted away, replaced by a slack-jawed disbelief. His eyes scanned the first page, the injunction, crisp and official, bearing the seal of the court. His face, which had been ruddy with success, went pale. It was the color of old parchment. He looked up at Davies, his mouth opening and closing silently, like a fish pulled from the water. Thorne, the developer, noticed something was wrong. His grin tightened. He stepped over to Marek and looked over his shoulder at the document. His reaction was faster, more volatile. His face flushed a deep, angry red. He started jabbing a finger at the paper, his voice a low, furious growl that I could almost feel through the cafe window. The news crews, sensing a sudden shift in the narrative, began to pivot, their cameras swinging away from the shiny renderings and zooming in on the unfolding human drama. This wasn't the ribbon-cutting ceremony they had been promised. This was a bloodbath. Mr. Davies just stood there, his hands clasped behind his back, a picture of serene patience. He let them absorb the full impact of the words on the page. Injunction, Vance Heritage Foundation. Grant District Preservation Covenant. Trusteeship. They couldn't build, they couldn't demolish, they couldn't sell, they couldn't so much as move a single brick on those 3 core properties without the express written approval of a foundation they had never even heard of. The panic began to ripple outwards. Marek's aide was speaking frantically into his phone. Thorne was now shouting, not at Davies, but at Marek, spittle flying from his lips. The illusion of partnership, of a united front, had shattered in an instant. It was no longer about a shared vision. It was about blame. It was about whose fault this catastrophe was. I took another sip of my coffee. In that moment, I felt a strange sense of detachment, as if I were watching a film of someone else's life. The noise from the street, the shouting, the rumbling engines of the now idle bulldozers, the excited chatter of the reporters seemed distant and muffled. My part in this was over. The silent, meticulous work was done. Now I just had to watch the noise unfold. I saw Marek finally find his voice. He was shaking his head, trying to dismiss the injunction as some kind of mistake, a bureaucratic snafu. I saw Davies respond with a single calm sentence. Then Davies turned and looked directly at me, across the street in the cafe window. He gave a small, almost imperceptible nod. It was a signal. The message had been delivered. I laid a few bills on the table, left my half-finished coffee, and walked out of the cafe, melting into the morning crowd before anyone could notice I was even there. They weren't just dealing with an archivist anymore. They were negotiating with the person who held the master key to their entire redevelopment plan, and they didn't even know my name. Or, so they thought. The name on the injunction wasn't mine. It was Eleanor's. It was the Vance Heritage Foundation. My anonymity was my final, perfect shield. The aftermath of the injunction was pure, unadulterated chaos, and I had a front-row seat from the quietest room in the city. My basement office became my observation deck. The news of the mystery foundation that had halted the city's biggest development project in a generation was the lead story on every local channel. Reporters swarmed City Hall, but the city had no answers. Marek, in a disastrous press conference, tried to spin the injunction as a minor legal hurdle, a frivolous claim by a fringe group that would be swiftly dealt with. But his face was tight with strain, and his hands trembled slightly on the podium. He looked like a man trying to plug a dam with his bare hands. The harder he pushed, the more the cracks spread. My loyal ally, Elena, became an invaluable source of intelligence. She described the atmosphere in the upper offices as a toxic storm. Marek was apparently in a state of perpetual rage, alternating between shouting at the city's legal department and making desperate, placating calls to Silas Thorne. Thorne, for his part, had made it clear that his patience and his financing was not infinite. His company, Thorne Development, had millions of dollars tied up in contracts and equipment, all of it now sitting idle. Every day of delay was costing him a fortune, and he was laying the blame squarely at Marek's feet. The slick, confident developer had been replaced by a furious creditor. Their beautiful partnership, toasted with champagne just weeks before, had devolved into a bitter, high-stakes divorce. The true power shift, however, didn't happen in the corridors of City Hall. It happened in the boardrooms of Thorne's investors and in the minds of the public. Silas Thorne was a developer, not a politician. His loyalty was to profit, not to Merrick's career. About a week after the injunction was served, he tried to go around the city. He hired a private investigator to find out who was behind the Vance Heritage Foundation. It took them less than 48 hours to trace the public filings back to Mr. Davies, and from there to me. I had expected it. I was prepared for it. One afternoon, as I was methodically cataloging a set of 1920s city water main blueprints, there was a knock on my basement door. It wasn't Elena. It was Silas Thorne himself. He stood there in his $1,000 suit, looking deeply uncomfortable in the dusty, poorly lit corridor. He had dismissed his driver and his assistant, an attempt, I suppose, at a personal touch. He wanted to speak to me, alone. I led him into my office. He had to duck his head to get through the doorway. He looked around the cramped concrete cell, at the bare bulb and the stacks of decaying ledgers, with a look of utter bewilderment. He couldn't reconcile the person who had so thoroughly outmaneuvered him with the person who worked in these conditions. That was his weakness. He saw power only in its external trappings, the corner office, the expensive car, the fancy title. He couldn't comprehend power that was internal, quiet, and strategic. He tried to be charming at first, calling the whole thing a misunderstanding. He said, "Arden, I have to admit, you're a formidable opponent. I respect that." He then launched into his real purpose. He opened a sleek aluminum briefcase and laid out a proposal on my cluttered metal desk. It was a buyout, a staggering sum of money for the Vance Foundation to dissolve its claim, to simply walk away. He told me I could name my price. He said, "Everyone has a price, Arden. What's yours?" I let him finish his entire speech. I let the silence hang in the air for a long moment, thick with the smell of old paper and his cloying, expensive aftershave. Then I looked him right in the eye and said, "Mr. Thorne, you're operating under a false assumption. You assume this is about money. It isn't. The textile district is not for sale." His charm vanished. The mask fell away, revealing the predator beneath. His voice dropped, becoming hard and menacing. He told me I was making a huge mistake. He spoke of legal battles that would bankrupt my quaint little foundation. He threatened to countersue me personally for tortious interference, to drag my name through the mud, to make my life a living hell. He was trying to intimidate me, to bully me into submission. It was the only tool he had left. I simply smiled, a real smile this time, calm and confident. I said, "Mr. Davies is already prepared for that eventuality. Mr. Thorne, are you?" He stared at me, his jaw clenched, realizing that his threats were as useless as his money. I had anticipated every move. He had run out of plays. He snapped his briefcase shut, turned without another word, and stormed out, leaving the scent of his impotent fury lingering in the air. That meeting was the turning point. Thorne's desperate attempt to buy me out, and my refusal was leaked to the press, not by me, but almost certainly by a disgruntled source within Thorne's own company. The story changed overnight. I was no longer an anonymous troublemaker. I was the basement archivist who said no to millions. Community support, which had been simmering, now boiled over. Heritage groups, neighborhood associations, and even the local artists' collective, who had long dreamed of turning the old mills into studios, rallied to my cause. The Vance Heritage Foundation was no longer a fringe group. It was the symbol of a grassroots rebellion against unchecked corporate development. Merrick's position became untenable. The city council, smelling blood in the water and facing an angry public, began to distance themselves from him. His bold new vision was now a political albatross. He made one last, desperate move. He called me himself. He offered me everything he had taken away, and more. My old job back, a significant raise, a permanent seat on a newly formed Heritage Advisory Board. He promised to work with me, to find a compromise. His voice was strained, pleading. It was the voice of a man standing on a trapdoor, begging the executioner not to pull the lever. I listened patiently to his offer, and when he was finished, I gave him my answer. "Thank you for the offer, Merrick," I said, my voice as cool and calm as the concrete walls around me. "But I'm no longer interested in a seat at your table. I'm building my own." Then I hung up. The power shift was complete. He had lost control of the narrative, the project, and his own future, and he still didn't understand that he had never really had it in the first place. The final act didn't take place in a courtroom or a boardroom. It took place on my turf. A week after I rejected Merrick's desperate offer, I received a formal request from the mayor's office. They wanted a meeting. Not with the city's legal team, but with me. They wanted to negotiate a path forward for the textile district. They were capitulating. I agreed, but with one condition: the meeting would not be at City Hall. Mr. Davies sent them the address. We were to meet inside the Albion Mill, the largest of the 3 properties my foundation now controlled. I wanted Merrick to see what he had tried to destroy, to stand within the very history he had dismissed as a carcass. The day of the meeting was gray and overcast, the light filtering softly through the huge, arched windows of the mill's main floor. The air inside was cool and smelled of old wood, machine oil, and time. The vast, open space was silent, the ghosts of 1,000 weaving machines holding their breath. Dust motes danced in the long shafts of light, like tiny, glittering spirits. It was a cathedral of industry, and it was my sanctuary. I was there first, along with Mr. Davies and Alina, who I had insisted be present. She had earned her place at this table. When Merrick arrived with the mayor and 2 visibly stressed city lawyers, he looked diminished, stripped of the trappings of his office, standing in the cavernous space of the old mill. He seemed small, his expensive suit looking out of place and absurd. His face was pale, and he wouldn't meet my eyes. The mayor, a pragmatic woman who cared more about political survival than Merrick's ego, took the lead. She was cordial, professional. She acknowledged the city's oversight regarding the grant charter and expressed a desire to find a mutually beneficial solution. They came expecting to negotiate with a bitter, demoted employee they could placate with a settlement. They were not prepared for what I had in store. I let them talk for a few minutes, outlining their revised proposals, a smaller development, perhaps preserving one of the facades. It was the same song, just a quieter verse. When they were finished, I didn't respond to their offer. I simply said, "Before we discuss the future, I think it's important to understand the past. Alina, would you?" Alina, no longer a timid junior archivist, but a confident young professional, stepped forward and handed a thin folder to the mayor. Inside were copies of the most damning emails between Merrick and Silas Thorne, the ones where they mocked the preservation laws, where they detailed their strategy to circumvent public oversight, where they referred to the city's heritage with open contempt. I had held these in reserve. This was my final move. The mayor's face hardened as she read. She passed a page to one of the lawyers, whose eyes widened in alarm. Merrick stared at the papers as if they were venomous snakes. He knew in that moment that it was over. There was no negotiating his way out of this. It was evidence of a deliberate conspiracy to defraud the city he was hired to manage. I finally looked directly at him. His bravado was gone, replaced by a raw, naked panic. I didn't raise my voice. I didn't need to. The quietest words are often the most devastating. I said, "You called my work an obstacle to progress, Marek. You tried to bury me in a basement because I refused to be your rubber stamp. You believe that progress means erasing everything that came before, but you're wrong." He flinched as if I had struck him. I continued, "This place, this history, it isn't an obstacle. It's a foundation. You can't build a future by digging up the past and selling it for parts. You build a future on top of it, with respect, with intelligence, and with a sense of responsibility to those who will come after us. My voice was steady, imbued with the quiet authority of the huge space around us. I wasn't the basement archivist anymore. I was the director of the Vance Heritage Foundation, the legal steward of this land. We were not adversaries. We were not even peers. I held all the power. I then laid out my terms, not a negotiation, but a declaration. The Vance Foundation would partner with the city on a new master plan for the district, a plan that prioritized adaptive reuse, that created a mix of affordable artist housing, small business incubators, and public green spaces. A plan that would be led by a committee of community stakeholders, architects, and historians. My foundation would have final approval on every aspect of the design and construction. There was no room for slick developers like Silas Thorne, the mayor, seeing the political victory I was handing her. A community-led feel-good revitalization project to replace Marek's toxic debacle, agreed to everything on the spot. Marek just stood there, mute and broken. He had been so thoroughly and completely defeated that he had nothing left to say. He was irrelevant. The meeting was over. As they left, I said one last thing to him, my voice just loud enough for him to hear. By the way, Marek, I want to thank you. Without that basement office, I never would have had the time and access to put all the pieces together. You gave me the very weapon I used to stop you. He didn't turn around. He just kept walking, a man already receding into the past. 2 days later, a short article appeared on the city's website. It announced that Marek had resigned his position as city manager, effective immediately, for personal reasons. He was gone. Silas Thorne's company quietly paid a massive penalty to get out of its contracts with the city and disappeared. They were footnotes now, ghosts in a story that was no longer about them. The new reality had set in. It wasn't my old reality, restored. It was a new one I had built from the ground up, on a foundation of brick and memory, and a promise I had kept. In the end, it was never about revenge. I know how that sounds. And maybe you don't believe me. Maybe you're sitting there thinking that every calculated move, every saved email, every quiet smile was fueled by a desire to see Marek fall, and perhaps a small human part of me found satisfaction in his demise. But the truth, the core of it, was simpler, and I think more profound. It was about the promise I made to Eleanor. It was about the belief she instilled in me, that our shared history is a fragile living thing, and it needs guardians. Marek was never the real enemy. He was just the latest incarnation of a timeless threat, the kind of person who sees value only in what is new, what is profitable, what is loud. My victory wasn't in his defeat, but in the survival of the textile district. My vindication wasn't in his public humiliation, but in the quiet hum of activity that now fills the old Albion Mill, not with bulldozers, but with architects and community leaders sketching out plans for a library, for workshops, for a place that will serve the future without erasing the past. A few months ago, we installed a small bronze plaque near the entrance of the newly restored Sterling Mill, which now houses a thriving collective of local artisans. It doesn't have my name on it. It reads the Vance Heritage Foundation, preserving the future by protecting the past. That, for me, is the real throne. It's not a title or a corner office. It's the quiet knowledge that something beautiful and important will endure because of the work that was done in the shadows. It's knowing that Eleanor's legacy is not just safe, it's thriving. So I want to speak directly to you now. To anyone who has ever been made to feel small, to anyone who has been overlooked, underestimated, or told that your passion is an obstacle. Your value is not determined by the title on your business card or the size of your office. Your power does not reside in the approval of people who are incapable of seeing your worth. Your true power lies in your knowledge, in your dedication, in your quiet, relentless commitment to the work that matters. Don't wait for them to recognize your value. Build your own structures. Create your own foundations. Play the long game. They may be playing checkers, with all its loud, aggressive forward moves, but you can be playing chess, seeing the entire board, thinking 10 moves ahead, and sometimes, the most powerful move you can make is the one they never see coming. Thank you for listening to my story. It means the world to know that I'm not alone in these feelings. If this resonated with you, if you've ever fought a quiet battle of your own, please let me know in the comments below. Your stories give me strength. And if you believe that stories like this need to be heard, please like this video, share it with someone who needs to hear it, and don't forget to hit that subscribe button and the notification bell so you don't miss what comes next. Because in the end, our shared stories are the most important heritage we have.